You have read the Challenger Sale book. If you haven't, it's a great read. Matt is really one of the visionaries in the space. I'm really excited to hear what he's going to tell us today before lunch. And then they have a breakout session later on for you to engage with them more directly on a one-on-one basis. So Matt, please join me.
My mic on? Yeah. Can everyone hear me all right? Having done this a lot, thank you to the Inside View team, to Umberto in particular, for inviting me out to this event. Having done many of these presentations, I've become quite a connoisseur of speaking slots and which ones are better and worse. This is a really good one, actually. I can tell you, in the two worst slots to draw when presenting, whether it's a global sales meeting or a conference like this, one of the worst slots to draw is right before lunch or a meal, like an outing kind of thing. It's pretty bad. People don't pay attention. They start filtering out. But the worst slot as a speaker to ever draw is the morning after the evening event. Imagine this room, but with nobody in it. That's kind of like what it is. So I've gone through that before. It's a painful experience. I think, as some of you may have read my bio, I'm a researcher by trade. You may be thinking, man, that really sounds awful, because this guy's going to force march me through data for an hour before I get to lunch. It's going to be terrible. I'm going to want a refund from Umberto on my ticket. I could have gone to the gym this morning. I could have stayed out for an extra drink last night. All kinds of great things I could have done. Instead, I've got to listen to this guy. So what I'm going to do, instead of force marching you through data, is I'm going to tell you a story. And it's a story I found has really resonated with heads of B2B sales and marketing around the world. It's a story that actually has its origins in a really, really dark time in B2B commerce. How many folks in the room were either carrying a bag or working in B2B marketing around late 2008, early 2009? So most people in the room, actually, some revenue capacity or commercial capacity at that time. And as you know, that was a really, really bad time to be in B2B sales and marketing. B2B sales, especially complex sales, is a tough business. It's a really, really tough business, though, when your customers don't want to buy anything that you're selling. And that was the environment into which we did this research. We're a membership-based organization, CEB is. We take our research marching orders from our members, heads of sales in my case, around the world. We work with about 700 companies, and it was in that environment that heads of sales came back to us and said, hey, look, the thing we really need your help with is trying to figure out how do we survive through this horrible, horrible selling environment. For many heads of sales, it was the worst sales environment they'd ever seen in their professional careers. And what they told us was, look, my guys are missing quota by miles. Our European members by kilometers. They're missing it by just a wide, wide margin. And I've got to figure this out. I've got to figure out how to break through in this really tough sales environment. And as we started to study this, we found that actually there was a bit of a mystery wrapped up into this. It wasn't merely a challenge of just figuring out how do you sell in a downturn, but rather, why is it that most people are missing their number by a wide margin, but some folks were continuing to crush their numbers, deliver 120, 130% of their quota, the kind of business, the kind of deals, the kind of deal volume and size that their peers would normally dream of, and during the downturn couldn't even fathom. But nevertheless, even in this really tough sales environment, some salespeople really were still bringing the number and were in fact crushing the number. And so as we dug into this, the question became, what is it that those folks are doing that's different from what the average salespeople are doing? And what could heads of sales bottle, if you will, from the top performers and export to the rest of the sales organization? And in some respects, that's always been the question in sales research. What do the best salespeople do, and how can we export it to everyone else to kind of lift all boats? When we got into this, as we started doing the data analysis and doing the research, two big findings came out. And you're going to see both of those in some detail. The first one that came out was that all salespeople can be statistically placed into one of 5 selling profiles. We've come to call these the 5 majors, or the 5 profiles of salespeople. We'll talk more about those in a few minutes. And while that was interesting, it's very interesting to researchers like me, the kicker was this: that when you look at performance, one of those profiles performs dramatically better than the rest. And one of them comes in very far behind, in fact, dead last. And here's the rub, that the one that comes in dead last happened to be the profile that most heads of sales would tell you they're placing their biggest bet on. It was the culture they were trying to build. It was the talent they were trying to bring into their organization. It's where all their training and coaching was geared toward. And for them to see that they were placing the biggest bet on the horse least likely to win the race, you can imagine was quite a gut punch. And that's really, I think, why this has captured interest out in the market and why we're still telling this story and talking a lot about this. So with that as a teaser, I can only disappoint, I think, from here on out. But let me start where all good sales story starts with, which is with the customer. What's going on in the customer world? And this is a story we've continued to update. The boxes, for those of you who read the book, aren't different from what you see in the book, but rather the stories and the nuance that are coming out of the conversations we have with heads of sales and marketing around the world have evolved significantly. And I'll give you guys a feel for what we're hearing right now in the world of B2B sales and marketing. So where the rubber hits the road, where selling happens, what's going on? It's a bit of the Clint Eastwood movie of selling. You've got good news, bad news, and there's some ugly news I'm going to talk about in a moment. The good news, customers' time horizons have extended. So if you think about selling in 2009, especially the early part of 2009, that was a tough time to be selling, especially when what you were selling was a long-term solution with a long-term payoff period, a multi-year time horizon on the deal, a 2, 3, 4, 5-year deal, when your customer was really only interested in staying in business for the next 4 to 6 weeks. So if suppliers couldn't help them generate short-term cash flow, they really weren't very interested in this long-term vision that you were pitching. And so the message to many salespeople was, look, if you can't help me generate short-term cash flow, if you can't help me stay in business, if you can't help me keep my job, then don't let the door hit you on the way out, because I don't want to talk about your 3 to 5 year vision, the solution that you want to sell us. That's changed. And so now the customers who've kind of made it through the worst part of the downturn actually are thinking a little bit more expansively. They're thinking longer term. They're not thinking about the next 4 to 6 weeks. They are, but they're thinking about the next 4 to 6 years. And that's a good thing for us for those of us who sell complex solutions that take several years to achieve full payoff, install and achieve full payoff for our customers. The second one is that contact turn is stabilized. When you think about sales at some level, and we'll talk more about the role of relationships in selling, but at some level it's people selling to people, right? That's a really tough thing to do when you go in and you meet with somebody and 2 weeks later they get laid off, or their department's been folded, or their function's been outsourced. Now that's slowed down. So the companies who've made it through the worst part of the downturn are running pretty lean and mean. Now the people who are left have very little tolerance for wasting their time, right? They're very busy, they're very time pressed, their budgets are tight, but they're still there 2 weeks later when you go visit them. So that's good news. And the number 3 thing, the third piece of good news here, is that those customers are open to new ideas in a way that they just weren't only a few years ago. So now when we sit down with customers, those customers who've made it through the downturn, and in some cases seen many of their competitors kind of get acquired, snapped up, just go out of business, are sitting down, they're telling our salespeople, look, we're now ready to have conversations about ways to boost our own competitiveness, to grab market share, to up our game. We want to have those conversations again. Again, a couple years ago it was just about staying in business. Now it's actually about getting competitive again. That's good news for salespeople, especially salespeople selling complex solutions. Not all good news, though, of course. There is bad news here, too. If you look at the bottom, number 4, if we track this across industries, most companies would tell us that average spend per customer is still down. It hasn't fully recovered to where it was in 2007, early 2008. And so that's a big piece of bad news, especially from the CFO's perspective. And then number 5, price pressure is significant, if not ridiculous. One head of sales we spoke to recently said, look, we do not have a deal that goes through without some ridiculous request for a price concession very late in the game before the customer signs the deal. Price pressure is significant. Procurement is involved in every single deal. Deals are going through RFP that used to not go through RFP, where procurement wasn't involved. Customers are really putting the screws to us around price. Okay, so some good news, some bad news. I promised as well some ugly news. This is really depressing so far, I admit. It's going to get better. Box number 6. These are some trends that we've been tracking for the past few years. I mean, if you've been reading any of the sales literature, you've seen a lot of people out there talking about some of these same trends as well. Let me talk about what these are, what each one of them is, and why we think they're happening, because I think that's an important part of the story. Number 6, first box in the ugly news category, is that consensus requirements continue to go up. Now, for those of us who've been selling for a long time, you remember the good old days of fight your way into the corner office, find the decision maker, sell them on a compelling vision, and then walk out with a signed contract. Or maybe not literally an on-the-spot contract, but something shortly thereafter. Now, when our salespeople go in and find that decision maker, they do all that hard work. They pitch them they send a compelling email. They capture their assistant on the phone. They get that time. They get into the corner office. they pitch them on a great vision. The decision maker looks our salesperson in the eye and says, this sounds great. I would love to do business with you. Sounds like a great idea that you guys are talking about. But I just need you to do one thing before we sign, before we agree to do business with you. And that one thing is this. I need you to go to meet with marketing. I need you to talk to finance. You're going to have to talk to all the end users. And you, of course, got to talk to IT because what you're selling is how to integrate with our systems, and so on and so forth, and on and on and on. Sales today, especially complex sales, has become a game of herding cats. The number of decision makers and stakeholders involved in selling a complex deal has gone up dramatically for every single company out there in the B2B landscape. It's no longer sufficient simply to get the decision maker on board. Now you got to get everyone on board. You get the whole organization on board. As a salesperson, what does that mean? That means that that deal you thought was coming in next Thursday is probably coming in a year from next Thursday, because it's going to take a long time to herd all those cats. And the likelihood that any of those people that CXO has sent you out to meet with raises their hand and says, you know what, I'm not so sure about your vision. I kind of like the other guys. I like the incumbent, or I designed the legacy system. So you're trying to come in and sell something that will replace the thing that I built my career on? No thanks. The likelihood that that's going to happen goes up significantly. Number 7, customers are pushing risk back onto suppliers. One of the things that we hear when we look at what decision makers actually care about, it's sort of a surprise, it's a bit depressing actually, is that the number one thing decision makers care about, their number one criterion for picking a supplier, it actually has nothing to do with what you sell. It's actually specifically whether everyone else on their team wants to buy from you too. That's an incredibly risk-averse posture for a decision maker, right? For a CXO to abdicate that kind of decision to the team. But what that tells you is that in today's day and age, especially when you're selling complex solutions that are risky, that are disruptive, that have a long-term payoff, decision makers aren't going to stick their necks out for it. They're not going to do it unless everyone else is on board. In fact, one of the things we're seeing come back in vogue now, and these things seem to come and go for those of you who've been in the space for a while, is gain sharing and risk sharing contracts. We're seeing these pop up all over the place, which is the idea that customers say to suppliers, look, I buy that your solution is going to deliver this kind of increase in revenue, or it's going to save this kind of cost for us, or cut this kind of cost for us, but rather than pay you for that up front, why don't we give you a down payment on it now? You install the solution, and then we'll share with you a bit of the upside or the cost savings a couple of years from now if it does what you promise. So pushing some more of that risk back on our plate. Number 8, as one head of sales told us recently, every customer wants their solution customized. They want it tweaked in some way, often ways that eat into our own profitability. They don't want to pay for it, but they all want it customized, and they expect it to be customized. And then number 9, probably the most troubling trend that we see going on right now, something we've been seeing happen really over the last 2 to 3 years, is the emergence of third-party consultants. These are folks who are in your customer's ear, basically advising them on how best to procure goods and services from companies like your own. In many cases, and as one head of sales told us, said these consultants, sometimes they're the big guys, the BCGs, the Accentures, the Deloittes, but oftentimes they're the salespeople that you fired a couple of years ago, who have now hung out a shingle, and their new business is to help your customers get the best pricing possible from you, often using data and tools that got them fired in the first place, which is a very frustrating thing. But this is happening over and over again. We used to see this only in healthcare, but now we see it across the board. There isn't a CSO we talk to in any industry who doesn't tell us that they see this happening to their salespeople, that there isn't some third-party purchasing consultant working with procurement, advising the customer on how to really put the screws to you as a supplier. Now, how does this play out? This is a finding that has really caught a lot of attention. We talked about this in an HBR article we wrote last year, and you heard Umberto talk about it as well. A lot of this has had the net effect of disintermediating the salesperson from the customer. In fact, when we go out and survey customers, this is data from several thousand customers, and we ask them, at what point when you bought your last large, complex solution, did you engage a salesperson in that discussion? And on average, what you find is that the purchase decision for the customer is nearly 60% over by the time the phone rings at the salesperson's desk. Think about that and contrast that with the old days. In the old days, before the web, before sophisticated procurement departments, before third-party purchasing consultants were all over the place, it was a world in which customers had to learn from salespeople. There's no other way to learn about solutions, about products and solutions in the B2B space. You pick up the phone, you call a supplier who you're pretty sure provided that solution, and you got an appointment with a salesperson to learn all about the thing that they could sell you, to help solve the business problem you had. But in today's day and age, customers can do a lot of that due diligence on their own. They go to the web, they can talk to procurement, they can go to their LinkedIn discussion group, they can get their third-party purchasing consultant on the phone. So by the time the phone rings for the salesperson, that purchase decision has progressed significantly. Now, by the way, it doesn't mean the customer got it right. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they've got a pretty baked conception of what their need is, how you fit into solving that need, and who else could also solve that need. One head of sales from a European chemicals company, we showed him this, this data, and he said, oh, this is the 1 of 3 problem. And we asked him, he said, well, what do you mean 1 of 3 problems? Doesn't make any sense. He said, well, that's what we call it internally. And he explained it to us. He said, a couple of years ago, about 25% of our business went through RFP. Now it's about 85%. And he said, we call it the 1 of 3 problem because every single time we're called to the table to bid on a piece of business, it's us and our 2 biggest competitors. It's always the same 3 suppliers. And our people go in and they pitch on all the stuff we've taught them to pitch on. They ask good questions about the customer's needs and objectives. They talk about our history and our value proposition. They talk about what makes our products and services better than the competitor. And every single time, increasingly what we're hearing is that customers look our salespeople in the eye and say, yeah, we know all that stuff about you. That's why you're 1 of 3 companies bidding for this piece of business. In fact, they'll agree to the fact that we're better than our 2 biggest competitors, and they still won't pay us for it. Because at this point in the purchase decision, the customer's actually not looking for maximum performance, they're just looking for minimum price. They've narrowed down the list of the suppliers who could solve the business problem they're looking to solve, and they just want the guys who are going to do it for the least amount of money possible. Anybody will do, it's minimum price that matters. And think about this is a fascinating phenomenon we're seeing happen in B2B. It's really transforming the B2B landscape. The consumer analogy I'd use is to think about car buying. It wasn't too long ago, it seems laughable now, but you think about the day when you had to go to the dealership to find out about car models, right? There was no other way to really find out. So you go to the dealership, the salesperson at the dealership would walk the lot with you. They'd walk you through, all the different models, the options available, the colors the car came in, the engine size, they'd pop the hood, you'd test drive it, all this stuff. And then you'd enter into this really opaque negotiating process that involved you, the salesperson, and the salesperson's manager who sat in some back office. And you drove off the lot, not knowing 100% whether you got a good deal or whether you got completely hosed. You really had no idea. Now contrast that with today. What do we do when we go to the car dealership? We walk in, we're armed with a ream of paper about what model we want, what color we want, what options we want, which package. Not only that, but we know how much the dealer paid for that car. And we also know how much everyone else in our zip code paid for the same vehicle. They get 1% below dealer invoice, 2, 3%. And so we walk in with a very baked conception of what we want. And in fact, we get kind of annoyed when the salesperson tries to tell us any different, right? If they try to sell us anything. We just want them to fulfill the order that's already in our head. So sales in the auto industry has turned into the fulfillment business. And it's maybe a bit extreme to suggest that B2B sales marketing is going that route, but the data suggests if we're not already there, we're going to be there pretty soon. Left to their own devices, customers will engage salespeople as late as humanly possible in the purchase decision. Now, when you think about this and you think about those ugly trends on the last page, the reason we think, we present this stuff, this blue arrow, and we present this, these ugly trends, and often we hear back from heads of sales, it's going to be really great when the economy turns around and some of this stuff goes away, not as much consensus building required, not such risk aversion from decision makers, not such a demand for bringing in third parties to make sure they get the best price, but people are a little bit more open to doing business with us mano a mano. And our perspective is that this stuff isn't actually going to go away anytime soon. In fact, all those ugly trends that you saw on the last page are actually a function of a reaction to our efforts as suppliers to move from selling products to selling solutions. So think about it from a supplier perspective. We've all gone down this path. We've all declared that we don't want to sell products. We don't want to sling product in the marketplace because that's really a race to the bottom on price. We don't want to get into the features and benefits selling game. What we want to do is sell solutions. Why? Because solutions are more profitable for us. It's not just products, it's products wrapped in layers of service. Solutions are stickier. They're harder to dislodge. If we got a 3 to 5 year deal with a company that's not just products, but products and services, and it touches every part of their business, every function of their business, boy, that's hard to dislodge when the contract is over, isn't it? The incumbent often wins, and that's why, because we've really integrated into the customer's workflow. But doing this, asking customers to take that risk with us, to pay more, to go on this long-term journey with us, to do something that's inherently more risky, when we do that, and it's good business for us, here's how the customer responds. What they've said is, look, if you're not going to transact product with us, if you're going to sell us solutions, then you're going to have to get more people on board. I'm going to push more of the risk on your plate, so you have skin in the game as well. I'm going to ask you to customize it in ways that are really tailored for our organization. And you know what? To really make sure I'm getting the best deal possible, I'm going to pull in some external advice, some third-party purchasing consultants to advise me on this. So again, our view is that even when the economy gets better, none of this stuff is going to go away. And as customers armed with information can push us farther and farther out in the purchase journey, many of those things will probably get worse. So this concludes the depressing portion of today's presentation. I think we should have confiscated shoelaces before people came in, but it's actually, it's an important backdrop, I think, to the story. It really is, to see what's going on out there in the world of B2B sales. But I think the big question is, well, how the heck do we get out of this? What do best salespeople do in light of all these really troubling trends? And what we see is there is this lead steer effect, that the best salespeople out there are actually going left when everyone else is going right. They're doing something that's really, really different, and we tried to document it here. Before I show you what best salespeople do, and we'll talk a bit about that, let me share with you a very important data point. If this is a story so far about why nobody wants to sell a single thing that, or buy a single thing that you're selling, what do customers want? Let's start at the highest level. What is it that customers are looking for from the suppliers they do business with? This same survey that we ran to try to understand where do customers engage with suppliers in the purchase decision, we also ran a concurrent customer loyalty survey. And let me explain to you how we did this research. We went out to thousands of customers, and when I say customer, I'm using a very big C customer definition. I'm talking about CXOs all the way down to end users and influencers, finance folks, procurement folks, legal, everyone who's involved in the deal on the customer side. And we asked them a whole battery of questions. We said, pick a supplier that you recently bought a complex solution from. I'm going to give them some parameters in terms of how to think about this. Now, compare that supplier against another supplier you could have bought a similar solution from. And compare those suppliers on about 40 to 50 different attributes. Okay? Things like their relative brand strength, their reputation, the product quality they offer, the customer service quality they offer, the price to value ratio, and lots of questions about the sales experience. Then at the end of the survey, we asked them to tell us how loyal they were to the supplier that they chose. And we didn't just ask about like kind of feel-good loyalty. I love their logo, they're really great, that kind of thing. What we asked them for was commercial loyalty. How likely are you to keep buying from this supplier, to buy more over time, and to advocate on that supplier's behalf? If somebody asks you who's a great provider in this space, how likely are you to say, well, it's these guys, we do business with them, they do great work? How likely is it for that to happen? So it's a real commercial definition of loyalty, if that makes sense. And when we run a factor analysis, when we regress all the data, we end up with a bar chart that looks like this. Now, this is the one graphic in all this whole presentation that's ended up in more boardroom level presentations than anything my group's ever put out. And the reason is, while not beautiful, it actually does answer a really important question. And the question is this: what do customers want from the suppliers that they do business with? What makes them loyal to the suppliers they work with? Now, we're probably all looking at the big bar on the right. We're going to get there in a moment, but I'd like to walk kind of left to right through this slide. When we think about it, if we were to brainstorm, just put your marketing hat on for a moment, if we were to brainstorm for a moment, what is it that customers look for from the suppliers they do business with? I think we come up with lots of great reasons. We would say, well, it's the brand, our brand in the market, our reputation in the market. It's the fact that we produce a fantastic product or great back-end customer service, or that we offer all of this at a very competitive price. And the truth is, we would have been right, but we would have been less than half right in terms of what actually drives customer loyalty. As part of this research, we went back to many of the customers who filled out the survey to ask them questions about why they filled it out the way they did, to help us make sense of this data. And when you walk through it, what you hear from customers is really, really eye-opening. So think about the things that we all commonly associate with loyalty: brands, reputation, product and service delivery, price to value ratio. When we talked to companies about this, or customers who filled out the survey, what we heard was some refrain that went like this. Those customers, we got on the phone and we said, hey, help us understand, why did you rank this supplier like this relative to its competition? You know, let's take brand, for example, and what they said was really, really eye-opening. They said, well, the guys that I evaluated have a great brand, don't get me wrong. In fact, we expected to hear the opposite. We expected to hear a lot of supplier bashing, but that's not what they did at all. They said, no, they've got a world-class brand, a fantastic reputation in the space. But so do the other guys. These guys make an excellent product. It does exactly what they say it's going to do. It fits in our workflow beautifully. But I've heard the other guys make a pretty good product as well. They deliver great customer service. When things go wrong, these guys swarm it. They've got this great account management team, customer support team out in the Midwest, and these guys are very friendly, and they solve all my problems, and they help me see through the end, and they really swarm it. It's fantastic. But you know what? I heard the other guys offer pretty good customer service too. And the pricing, well, I feel like we got a good deal, but I don't know that we're getting a rock bottom deal. I think other people offer pretty competitive pricing too. Over and over and over again, what we heard from these customers was that they perceived very little difference on any of these dimensions on the left-hand side. Any of the things that we, as suppliers, take great pride in, right? And I'm a product person, so it's very painful to hear. But customers told us that things like brand, product quality, service quality, value to price ratio, that these things in their eyes are not that distinct one supplier to the next. And in fact, many of these things they see as very commoditized. Doesn't mean these things don't matter. And our advice often to companies is, look, if you got a bad reputation, your brand stinks, your product doesn't do what you say it's going to do, and your customer service is bad, you've got bigger problems. You should probably fix those things. But in the eyes of customers, they don't perceive these things as being nearly as different as we think they are. They see them as being fairly commoditized. Those same customers, though, unprompted, would quickly go to the areas where they did see difference. And many of those areas came down to the sales experience itself. What these customers would say was something like this. Look, the real difference, if I were to really get down to it, the real difference between the guys I do business with and the folks who didn't get the deal are the fact that the folks who didn't get the deal, these guys come into my office and they steal hours of my life that I never get back. These guys are time vampires. I'll tell you a bit more about what that feels like from the customer perspective. Now, the guys I do business with, when their people show up, the conversation is very different. They deliver a sales conversation that I would actually pay for. It's a phrase from Neil Rackham. It's a really powerful one. Think about that as a litmus test and what that means and how many of your salespeople are right now delivering a sales conversation that your customers would actually write a check for. Whether or not they bought anything from you, they would pay for the time that your salesperson gives them. That's what these customers said they really valued. And we dug into that a bit. We found that it really corroborated the data you see on the right-hand side. When we look at the factor, the sales experience factor, when we pick it apart and we look at the data points within it, you find it's the kind of sales experience that delivers this kind of lift on customer loyalty is one in which salespeople offer a unique and valuable perspective on the market. And they help the customer navigate through different alternative ways of solving business problems. They help them avoid stepping on landmines. They educate them on new issues and outcomes. As customers told us, these are the sales conversations where the salesperson shows up with new ideas. New ideas for me to make money, for me to save money, for me to avoid risk, for me to see around corners the problem I don't see coming right now, for me to engage my employees, steal market share, things that I haven't thought of before. So what do the time vampiring conversations look like? Those kind of fell into two categories, and I think one we're pretty familiar with in sales, and the other one I think is a bit of a surprise. The first one was what we've tried to come up with a different expression to describe this one, but for lack of a better expression, I'll just use it. The show up and throw up sales call. So we all know this. This is the when the salesperson shows up and spends 55 of the 60 minutes they have with the customer talking all about their company. Right? Talking about all about how old they are and the history of their product evolution and how global they are and all the big companies they do business with. And then they launch into an exhaustive description of the new XP 1000 that they're bringing online and why it's great and why it's better than the XP 500 and so on and so forth. And they save a little bit of time at the very end of the call to ask the customer if they'd like to continue the conversation. Customers hate that kind of sales call, not surprisingly. And to be fair, in sales, we've been trying to get out of that sales pitch for a really long time. We have salespeople who still do it. We all do. But we know that doesn't work for the customer. We know it's all about us, not about the customer. The surprise, though, for us was when we asked customers, they said, look, it was not just the show up and throw up, it's when the salesperson also shows up and asks open-ended questions. When the salesperson shows up and asks me what's keeping me up at night, or the salesperson shows up and asks me what my strategy is, what are my objectives, and how they tie to what the CEO is paid on, what's going to get me fired or promoted this year. Those questions, while they come from a very good place from the salesperson, and customers will give our salespeople credit for that all day long. They say, look, it's based on the Covey principle of seek to understand before you are understood. It comes from a good place. It's the salesperson's desire to show empathy, to really understand the customer's business. What the customer tells us is, look, you have to understand as a salesperson, let's say I'm a CIO, you as a salesperson meet with more CIOs in a week than I meet with in a year. Don't ask me what's keeping me up at night. Tell me what should be keeping me up at night. What's the thing that those guys are worried about? What are your most progressive customers doing with your solutions to capture market share, to cut costs, to generate revenue that I'm not thinking about? Tell me the thing I don't know. And what they say is, look, all these questions that salespeople come in and ask, and by the way, it's a very undifferentiated sales experience, because you think about it from a CXO, from a decision maker perspective, how many salespeople they meet with in a week who all come in and ask the same 20 questions. It's a bit like death by questioning for the customer.
And what the customers tell us is it's based on a flawed assumption that I actually even know what I need to begin with. What I actually need to know is the thing I don't know. Bring the new idea to the table. Start with an idea. Doesn't mean questions don't matter. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Questions play a critical role in the sales conversation, but the open-ended question strikes the customer as putting the job of selling on the customer's plate, not on the salesperson's plate. Start with an insight, and then we'll spend all day answering your questions, telling you all about our business. Tell me the thing I don't know. Start with new ideas, new opportunities. It's a teaching-based sales conversation, effectively, that customers are looking for. And if you were to wrap this up in a nutshell, what this slide says is that more than half of business-to-business customer loyalty is a function not of what we sell, but actually of how we sell it. Doesn't mean what you sell is unimportant. Again, if it stinks, you better fix that. But the opportunity to outperform the competition on the right-hand side, the nature of the sales experience is huge. And it turns out that most of customer loyalty is a function not of what you sell, but the insight you deliver as part of the sale itself. And we're going to talk more about how to do that. But I tell you, the big sort of troubling finding, I think, here for heads of sales is that most of their salespeople don't deliver that kind of sales experience. I think, if they were to be self-critical, they'd say, look, I have a hard enough time getting my folks to sell. Now you want them to teach, you want them to deliver insight, you want them to bring a new idea the customer hasn't even thought of. That feels like a pretty high bar. I get it that my stars can do that, but how can my average performing salespeople really do this? Who delivers that kind of sales experience? What kind of content do they need to walk into a sales conversation with to have that kind of conversation? And what we found is getting this right is a function not just of having salespeople taught to sell in the right way, but having an organization that can equip the salesperson with the kind of insights they need to deliver that kind of sales experience. So we're going to talk about both of those pieces here in a moment. Let's talk about the salesperson angle first. We've been running a global study now of salespeople. It's a manager-led assessment, very similar to the loyalty study we ran with customers. In the manager assessment, what we asked sales managers to do was evaluate their salespeople on a scale, one against the rest, on a whole variety of dimensions. Here are some samples. Here's about 50 different variables we tested. We tried to steer clear of things that are purely nature, things like personality. Or strengths. And there's a lot of great work on that stuff. We tried to focus on here stuff that's teachable for the average salesperson. So we focused on attitudes, skills, activities, and knowledge. So for example, these salespeople, how willing are they to risk disapproval? How goal-oriented are they? Are they attached to our company? Are they intellectually curious? Do they try hard? Skills and behaviors. Do they have good business acumen? Could they navigate a balance sheet if they had to? Are they good at customer needs assessment, negotiation, solution selling, teamwork? Activities. Do they follow our sales process? Do they fill out their expense reports? Before they go on a visit, do they actually use a tool like InsideView to actually get armed with information about the customer so they walk in with a basis of understanding about the customer's business? They do their homework before the sales call. Knowledge. How much do they know about our products, our services, and our customers and their industry and where they operate? So we tried to get a really holistic view of these salespeople. And then, of course, we collected performance data as well around all these sales folks. We started with about 1,000 salespeople in the study. It's now about 25,000 people. In fact, we just did a study of salespeople in Asia in the breakout session. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I found some interesting differences in the data that are pretty powerful and really speak to where the APAC market is right now for those of you who sell there. But about 25,000 salespeople in the study, and what you're going to see here is kind of the high level that's the story that is the aggregated view across all of those data points. The first finding, as I told you earlier, is that we found when you throw all this data up in the air, and I mean that in a scientific way, and it falls down on the ground, it actually falls into 5 different categories. And we call these factors or the profiles or the majors of the salesperson. We're going to look at these 5 profiles. We're going to walk through them here in a moment. But as you think about them, think about your own approach to sales. Think about your colleagues. Don't raise your hand. Don't point fingers. Nothing like that. The important thing to think of here is that these are not mutually exclusive profiles. Okay, so every salesperson's got some combination of these. In fact, your best salespeople can do all 5. And they can do all 5 or any of the 5 on the fly when in front of the customer. So they're not mutually exclusive. There is overlap. But what we find is every single salesperson in our study can be statistically placed into emphasizing one of these 5 approaches to selling. They major in one of these 5 approaches, much like college. So we all took the core curriculum, but what's our emphasis? Some of us are chemistry majors, some of us are finance majors, some of us are business majors. What's the thing that sets us apart? And that's what you're looking at here. these are the 5 majors of professional selling that we found in the data. And again, every single one of those 25,000 salespeople can statistically be placed as majoring in one of those 5 categories. Doesn't mean they don't have the other ones, but they emphasize one above the other 4 as their primary posture with the customer. Let's go through these for a moment here. The hard worker. So the hard worker is the nose to the grindstone seller. They are the person who gets in early, stays late, places more phone calls than anybody else on the team, knocks on more customer doors than anybody else. They're a pleasure to manage, not only because they get in early and stay late, but also because they're always asking for feedback from the manager, always looking to eke out that 1% performance improvement in terms of how they sell. We got the challenger. Now, those of you who know the title of the book and title of the presentation, you know who wins, so act surprised when we get to that point. I'm an okay storyteller, not a great one, but you got the challenger. Now, the challenger is the debater on the team. The challenger's got a provocative point of view, and they're not afraid to use that point of view to push the customer a bit, to push them outside their comfort zone, again, to think a little bit differently about their own business and about the opportunities that lay ahead. And they got deep understanding of the customer's business, and they're not afraid to push the customer a bit, as I said before. Now, here's the problem with challengers, and we've heard this from many heads of sales, is some heads of sales, when they've seen the story, are especially troubled because they said, I tried to fire all those people over the last few years because they're a pain in the ass. And here's why, excuse the expression, but these are the folks who will actually corner the CEO at the water cooler and give them an earful about how we should be going to market, what our strategy really should be, and they'll sit down with HR and talk about how to really maximize payout on the comp plan and how, the coverage model and how it should really be structured. They are not afraid to share their opinion internally or externally, and in that respect, culturally, they're a tough fit in many organizations for that reason. Relationship builders. Now, when you think about the relationship builder, it's not this caricature of the glad-handing 5-martini lunch, rounds of golf kind of salesperson. That's a bit of a caricature I don't think really exists very much today in professional selling. But this person's posture is one of acquiescence. It's a classic sales profile. The relationship builder's approach to engaging the customer is one of reactive acquiescence. Whatever the customer needs, whatever the customer wants, the relationship builder sees it as their job to try to fulfill that need, even if it eats into the profitability for their own company, even if it means them stretching the rules or doing something that's a little bit outside the guardrails of what makes us money as a business. They view it as their job, no matter what the customer asks for, to go back to their own company and to advocate for that customer, to pound the table and say, this is what's right for the customer. We need to give them that discount. We need to flex on the terms and conditions. We need to customize the solution in this way. And as a result, customers love that, right? They build great relationships, not to reuse the term, with customers. They're very generous with their time. They're there. They're eager to serve the customer. One head of sales saw this and said, I know exactly who these people are on my team. They're the people, when I walk the floor of the sales organization, who I hear religiously every month calling up every single customer in their territory saying, hey, I just want to let you know, it's Bob from Acme Company. Just want to let you know I'm here. Whatever you need, I've got you covered. And it sounds funny, right? But it's true. When you think about the salespeople we see out there in organizations, and we hear this from sales leaders all the time, that characterizes a big chunk of their sales organization, this reactive, acquiescent posture. Okay, you've got lone wolves. Lone wolves are a bit of the prima donna of the sales organization. This is the part where you shouldn't raise your hands. They don't follow the sales process. They don't file their expense reports on time. They build their own marketing materials. In many cases, they sell things you don't even make. And you know, they actually, their posture is ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? So I'm going to ask for forgiveness. And the truth is, in every big mature sales organization, you find 15 to 20% of the sales force are lone wolves. And often, many of those are high performers, as you'll see in the next page. The reason is that we let people break the rules as long as they hit their number, you know, and they don't break the law. But it's the minute they stop hitting the number and they stop delivering that revenue that we have a tough conversation about getting in line and starting to follow the process and follow the rules. Okay, problem solvers. We renamed this in the book. We call it the reactive problem solver. The truth is all salespeople are in the business of solving customer problems. But what makes this person different is they're a bit like a customer service rep in salesperson clothing. Their view, and again, it comes from a very good place, but their approach with the customer is that they are more focused on post-deal execution in implementation than in getting the next deal signed. Does that make sense? So their view is, look, I make lots of promises as a salesperson to the customer over the course of the sales conversation and selling the solution to this customer. I want to make sure all those promises are kept. Again, it comes from a very good place. Customers love that, but sales managers hate it because rather than letting the implementation team, the account team, whoever's in charge of installing the solution for the customer, managing it, take care of all the problems that inevitably crop up, they put themselves in that position and they see their job as taking care of all those problems rather than getting the next deal through the pipeline. It doesn't mean it's a bad profile. It's a critical competency for a company. It just may mean that you don't want your salespeople actually playing that role. Now, let me show you on the next slide how these folks perform relative to one another. As I told you, when you think about your sales organization, you think about the makeup, it's an interesting kind of academic exercise to think about how these profiles overlap with your existing sales force. So names and faces in each of these categories, yourself, for example, your boss. But where are the spikes? If you were to put your finger on where in your sales organization do you have the preponderance of sellers, which category would it be? Relationship builders? Hard workers? Lone wolves? We've seen that from time to time. But think about the sales organization. Think of this as sort of a taxonomic way of viewing the sales organization and segmenting your salespeople into these different categories. The bigger question is, though, is how they perform relative to one another. So let me show you that here on the next page. Now, just to be clear, one of the things we didn't do is study low performers. And part of the reason is that low performers do a lot of things wrong, and it's not a lot to learn there. What we studied was the question that heads of sales care about, which is, how do I move the core? How do I move the middle 60% of the sales force a little bit to the right? How do I get them to emulate and to practice and to exhibit some of those characteristics and those skills and those attitudes and those behaviors we know characterize top performers? So here you're looking at the contrast between what we call core performers, the middle 60% of the sales force, and high performers, the top 20% of the sales force. Now, if you squint at the slide, I see some of you in the back are squinting. If you squint at the slide and look only at the gray bars for a moment, the light bars, this is the distribution of average performing salespeople across these 5 profiles. And what you find here is there's pretty good representation in all 5, or across all 5 profiles. As one head of sales in I think a fairly mean-spirited way said, so what you're telling me is there's 5 ways to be average. And that's kind of what it says. But look at the high performers for a moment and contrast it with the core. When you look at the dark blue bars and you look at the high performers here, what you find is there's one dominant way to be a high performer, one preferred major when it comes to your sales approach to be a high performer, and that's the challenger approach. Nearly 40% of high performers fall into that challenger profile. And the bigger contrast, I'll tell you, the bigger gut punch for heads of sales is what you see all the way over on the right, is how few of the high performers fall into that relationship builder category. And this is the one, it's a bit like the stages of mourning or stages of grieving. And the heads of sales look at this, and they're very interested to understand what makes a challenger tick and how do I find these people and teach people the challenge and this kind of stuff. But first they want to understand, why does the relationship builders do so badly? Why are they not a bigger percentage of the high performer population? Because if I were to have bet, I would have said that's where we would have made that's the profile we need to be successful as a sales organization. That's the culture I'm trying to build. Everyone I bring in, I screen them for having that capability. I just got up on the national sales meeting stage last year, and I told everyone the way we're going to grow is by going out and building better relationships with our customers. Find a customer, hug a customer, build a moat around that customer, do whatever they need, protect us from the competition. And now you're telling me maybe that's not the right approach. You're telling me that relationships don't matter to being a salesperson. So let's dig into what that actually means and what it doesn't mean, I think, importantly. When we contrast the 2 extremes, so again, we're talking about the challenger at almost 40% of high performers against the relationship builder at about 7% of high performers. Here are the actual data points that factored together to describe those 2 different profiles. I'll give you the high level before. This is the drill down on challenger versus relationship builder. And let's go sort of step by step and walk through these. The first thing we know is that the challenger teaches the customer. Now, if I had only told you guys that what customers are looking to buy is new insight, and then I told you that the challenger is the one who delivers insight, you probably would have guessed, and you would have been right, that the challenger wins. They are the one who shows up at the customer's doorstep with the new idea to make money, the new idea to save money, avoid risk, engage employees, the problem around the corner they don't see coming. And that's what they do. They have that unique perspective. But that's not all they do. And the rest of it is critically important as well. And one of the things that challengers do really well is that they're very effective at tailoring that message depending on the person sitting across the table from them. So they can't take an insight like a hammer and walk around and just sort of knock down every nail with it. That insight is going to resonate very differently for a CMO versus a CSO versus a CIO or a CFO or, God forbid, a procurement person. It's going to resonate very differently depending on where that person is in the food chain. So we've got to think about how do we tailor it for the individual. It's going to vary by company. If you operate across multiple geographies, well, it's going to vary quite a bit culturally, right? And so we've got to actually tailor that message for the person sitting across the table to really make it resonate. The third thing they do is that they're assertive. In the book, we call it taking control. And this is the one I think we get the most kind of misreads on, because when people hear the term challenger, and we did this to ourselves for sure, but they hear the term challenger, they hear the idea of taking control, and immediately the mind goes to aggressive and obnoxious sales tactics, right? And we jokingly say in the book, but it really is no joke, that if this was about aggressive and obnoxious used car salesman tactics, we would have called this person the jerk and not the challenger. But that's not what it is. Asserting control is quite a bit different. Now, if you think about the spectrum or continuum of sales behaviors that your salespeople can exhibit, on the one hand, you've got passivity, right? Passivity is about doing whatever the customer wants. It's not about your interests, it's about their interests. And the other end is aggressive behavior. That's all about what I want, not what the customer wants. Assertiveness is right in the middle. It is about holding your ground, but in a professional and empathetic way. Let me illustrate by example here. You see the data points here. Comfortable discussing money can pressure the customer, but I find that it's best illustrated by through story. So having interviewed many of these challengers, what we find is many different examples of how they assert control in a way that's a bit atypical for salespeople. Here's one example. When you show up at the sales conversation with your customer with this new insight, this idea that they haven't thought of before, most customers are going to say something like this: well, we're a bit different. And we all know, all of our customers think that they're totally different, right? We know that that's not true, but their knee-jerk reaction when presented with a new idea, one that they themselves hadn't come up with before, an opportunity they didn't see coming, a problem on the horizon that they weren't thinking about before, is to say, well, we're a bit different. How does a relationship builder respond to that pushback versus a challenger? Now, the relationship builder's response is probably, you know what, you're probably right. Let me put this data aside, what I was going to share with you. Let me put that aside and let's talk about what's keeping you up at night. Let's get back to something that makes you happy to talk about. The challenger's response is, I totally get it. Every company I meet with, I've come to really appreciate those differences that make one company distinct from the next, and I want to talk about that, but I also want to make good use of your time. And I know that CIOs like yourself have found a lot of value in the data that I brought to these conversations. So let's walk through that, and then let's see if we can square the circle and see if this actually applies in your organization and in what way it's relevant. So holding your ground, but in a professional but courteous way. Think of the other end of the sales continuum, the pricing discussion. And we all know that the salesperson is typically confronted with that last-minute discount request before the customer signs a deal. How does the salesperson respond, the challenger, the relationship builder, when asked for that 5% discount? When the CXO is sitting there with the contract on their table saying, you know, you've built the consensus, you've got everyone on board, you've customized exactly the way we need, we are ready to do this, we're really excited, but there's one thing that's gnawing at me, and it's the price. And is there any way we can bring this down another 5%? I will sign this deal right now if we can do that. What do you do? This hasn't happened to me, but my co-author, Brent Adamson's presented this a few times, and he said on 3 different occasions at national sales meetings, when he asked that question to the audience, which he doesn't ask anymore, there was a voice, a very small voice from the back of the room that said, give them 6%. So that's a career-limiting moment, if ever there was one. But and certainly the CFO is nervously scribbling, I think probably that person's name, so they can go talk to them afterwards. But really, it's a caricature of what actually happens. But think about the relationship builder's posture, one of acquiescence. They may not cave on the spot, but what they're probably going to do is try to back the customer off the 5% and get them into like 2-3% discount. Let me see if I can get that approved by my manager, by my finance department for you. And what they've effectively done is entered into a price-based discussion under the premise that they think they're negotiating, right? They've been taught to negotiate, and by getting the customer from 5 to 2 or 3, they've somehow won. Now, this isn't to suggest that challengers don't discount. Surely they do. But what they do first is to get the conversation back to value. Say, look, I understand that the price may be a hang-up right now, and we're going to have to cross that bridge for sure. But what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time going over the value points of the solution we're going to deliver to you, what value is going to deliver to your company, and make sure we're in agreement about that. Because we've been talking to each other for a year now about this solution. We're ready to do this, and I want to make sure we are completely in sync about the value we're going to deliver. And I think in the course of that conversation, we might surface some other areas that I'm underappreciating that are going to deliver tremendous value to your company. Maybe we can up those things that would actually be more cost effective for us, deliver more value for you. So let's have that conversation first before we have the discount conversation. So they acknowledge and they defer. And one of the other examples I hear a lot about taking control and what it looks like has to do with this 57% phenomenon we talked about earlier. And what happens when the phone rings and the customer calls in, let's say it's a customer you've been chasing for years, They've always put you off. They have an incumbent supplier. They're pretty happy with them. What happens when the phone rings and they say, hey, great news. I know we've not called you in to pitch to us before, but we're actually considering putting this system out to bid, or this piece of business out to bid. We've got time next Friday. We're calling in you and your two biggest competitors to come in. We're going to send you the RFP. Come in and pitch for this business. Everyone who's anyone is going to be in that room. The CXO, the CFO, we're going to make a decision right after that meeting. Come in. You've got an hour next Friday. Give it your best shot. Based on everything I understand about you guys, I think it's a great fit. What's the salesperson's response? When they think about the relationship builder, it's like manna from heaven, right? So they're forecasting that deal for the Monday after the presentation because they know that that is a perfect situation. Everyone's gonna make the decision to be in that room. It's a perfect fit. The RFP is like T-ball for us. We're gonna go in, we're gonna talk about our solution, and we're gonna get this deal. Think about the challenger's perspective, though, and we've asked challengers about this, and one in particular really sticks out in my mind. He said, look, this happened to me actually just a few weeks ago. So I was called in by a company that I had been pursuing for a very long time. They had an incumbent supplier. We'd never done any business with them. Always been trying to get them to change their mind about the supplier they were working with. They called me up out of the blue and said, hey, we're going to put this out to bid. We're going to see about switching suppliers. And it was exactly the situation you described, the buying committee meeting next Friday. But what I knew in the pit of my stomach was they already decided who they're going to buy from, and it's not me. And the only reason they're going through this dog and pony show is because somebody in procurement or finance is making them do it. We're column fodder, right? They're using us as leverage against the supplier they really want to buy from to make sure they get the best price. And so we asked him, well, what did you do? And he told us this really eye-opening story. He said, I walked into the RFP, into the bake-off. I went first. The other two guys are out in the lobby, ready to give their pitch. And I did something that I've tried to do when the opportunity presents. I said, look, I've got an hour with you guys, a very senior audience today. I'm really grateful for the time. Here is the response to your RFP. Big kind of stack of paper, handed out copies. Said, I'm going to let you read that on your own time. It's everything you've asked for. It is no different from what the other two guys are going to come in and pitch to you. It's exactly what you guys spec'd out. We think it's a great solution. What I'd like to do is spend the hour with you that we have today, since your time is precious, talking about the three things that weren't in your RFP, but why they should have been, and why they're critical to actually solving the business problem you want to solve. In the course of that discussion, ended up blowing up their conception of what they were even trying to do to begin with. The CEO who was on this buying committee actually sent all three suppliers packing, restarted the RFP process, and redesigned it around those criteria that salesperson had taught them were important. They ultimately won the deal. It sounds like a bit of a high-wire act, and we'd love if all our salespeople did that, but that's what it means to take control. Again, it's not about being aggressive or obnoxious. It's about being empathetic and professional, but assertive, holding your ground, pushing back when appropriate, and not caving. Now compare this with the relationship builder. The relationship builder's posture, again, is one of acquiescence. They get along with people. They're likable. They're very generous with their time. They act as an advocate for the customer back in their own organization. If you were to sum it up, what you'd say is the relationship builder is about reducing tension. Wherever tension comes up with the customer, whether it's about pricing, whether it's about the new idea you brought to the table, whether it's about access, the relationship builder tries to make it go away. It's like whack-a-mole. Make the tension go away. The challenger, though, uses tension to their advantage, and they use that to advance the conversation, to advance the deal, to create what we call constructive tension. Now, the big question, I think, is, does that mean relationships don't matter at all to salespeople? And actually, it's not true. What we know statistically is that challengers minor in relationship building. So they're actually the second best relationship builders of the 5 profiles. But what that tells you is that in today's day and age, in a world in which customers can educate themselves about ideas and opportunities and issues and outcomes and what you do as a supplier, that just being likable and acquiescent and reacting to what the customer wants is table stakes. They need a good relationship. If your customer hates you, you've got bigger problems. You need a good relationship to get in the door with the customer and to sit down with them. But in today's day and age, what the real currency of the relationship is actually insight. It's the new insight you can bring to the table. And really interesting thing we hear back from companies who've gone down this path, they've told us, look, what we found is that the challengers out there end up building better relationships than the relationship builders. Because they built a relationship founded on business value, not just on being reactive and acquiescing to whatever the customer wants. They bring new insights to the table. They treat the relationship not as an end unto itself, but a means to an end, if that makes sense. So again, relationships are critical, but in today's day and age, they're table stakes. They're necessary, but not sufficient to effective selling. Now, One of the things that we found in the early going, we were telling the story was, is this a story about selling in a downturn, or is it a story about just selling in a complex environment? We think it's actually the latter, and here's why. When we cut the data by complexity, so sales complexity, what we find is pretty startling. If you were to look at transactional selling on the left-hand side, think of this as product selling. This is where sales is a machine. It's a volume game. You're slinging product, you're competing on price, it's volume of visits in equals deals out on the back end. Sales is a numbers game here. If that's your world, if that's how you sell, then really Challenger's probably too much club, to use a golf metaphor. You're better off actually hiring a lot of hard workers. Why? Because hard workers get in early, they stay late, they place lots of phone calls, they follow a script, and they ask for feedback after the call. It's a great model. But most companies, and I think most companies in this room, are on a journey from the left to the right. How do we get out of just selling product, a race to the bottom on price, and into selling solutions? How do we sell those more embedded, higher margin, stickier solutions to our customers? And when you cut the profiles and you look at highly complex sales, solution sales, what you find is challengers are more than half of the high performers in that world. And relationship builders fall off the grid almost entirely. And here's why. When you go in with a disruptive idea, selling a solution in many respects is about selling a behavior change to the customer. And when you go in with a disruptive solution, if your posture is, hey, whatever you need, I've got you covered, well, what the customer wants is not to buy your solution, but it's going to be disruptive, it's going to be difficult to implement, it's going to require lots of change for them, and change is hard. So what they want you to do is take your insight or your solution, stick it in your bag, and get out of my office. The challenger, though, is able to create that tension necessary to advance a conversation, because they know selling a solution is a behavioral change. It's about getting the customer to stop doing one thing and to start doing something else. In that, to get them there, you've got to create some element of tension in the course of the conversation. You've got to show them why what they're doing right now is wrong, why it's suboptimal, and why there's a better way to move forward. All of this, though, I think one of the important things to take away is that this is all about salespeople. And oftentimes, we are asked to come and present this material at the national sales meeting for a company, and they actually want us to stop the presentation here because they want all their salespeople to go out and challenge customers. And what we tell them is be really careful when you do that. Telling an army of salespeople to go out and deliver insights to customers will get you many, many bad things. One thing is they'll teach customers about insights that you can't really help the customer with, but maybe your competitors can. Maybe better than you can. And so your customers will flock into the open arms of your competitors. Or maybe they'll actually teach your customers about problems that nobody can solve, thereby actually giving your customers something that will keep them up at night. Now, that's actually, that's problematic. And so the reality is your best salespeople can do this. Were it not for the fact that best salespeople were already doing this, we wouldn't have found it in the data. So some salespeople do this effectively, and they do it on the fly. It's intuitive to them, but most salespeople don't. And they really need the help of the organization to equip them with insights to go in and challenge customers. The worst thing you want, because there's no scale in it, is telling 1,000 salespeople to go out and teach your customers things. Make them smarter about stuff. Bring insights to the table. So what you'll find is it creates a lot of capability stretch. It pulls your product organization in all kinds of different directions. We've all been in that situation, the product folks in the room, when you sit down with the salesperson, you say, well, let me get this straight. What did you sell them? Because I think we don't really do that. You know that, right? So, and that's what you get when you do that. So the role of the organization is critical. And when we dissect the companies who do this really well, we find that their sales conversations follow 4 distinct pillars. I'll talk about those and give you an example here on the next slide. We call this commercial, the idea we call here commercial teaching. This is, as one head of sales told us, a really boring name that some researchers came up with. It's like calling Coke brown fizzy water. But the name actually says something important. It's not any teaching, it's commercial teaching. It's teaching designed to get your customer to buy more of your stuff. Okay, so let's be very clear about that. It's not just about altruistic behavior, making your customer smarter. It's about getting them to value the things that you can actually do for them. Getting that right requires that you first come up, or you figure out, how do you tell the story that leads to your unique strengths? Now, contrast this with how most of us sell and how most of our sales pitches are built. I haven't seen any of the sales pitches from any of your companies, but I can hypothesize what they look like. The first slide is your mission and values as a company. You're green, you're socially responsible, you're innovative, you're entrepreneurial, you're customer-centric, so on and so forth. The second slide is the logos of your best-known products, the things on the market that you're most proud of that people would know by name. The third page is your brag sheet of logos, so all the companies you do business with, designed to give a sense of credibility to the customer. And somewhere around slide 4 is a map of the world. Every company's got one of these because it's really important that you demonstrate that you're global, or you cover the entire United States, or whatever your market is that you sell in. I mean, you think about those things, it's not that they're unimportant, but they're actually not about the customer at all. That's leading with your strengths, not leading to your strengths. In a challenger sales conversation, in a commercial teaching conversation, all that stuff goes at the end of the sales conversation. In fact, in the best pitch decks we've seen, we see companies putting this at the very, very end, not even mentioning their name, their company name, until the very, very end of the pitch deck. Getting that right, though, requires answering a really important question, which is, what is it that actually makes you unique? Okay, that's actually a really hard question. I'll borrow the term from my friend Dave Brock, who said this is the notion of radical simplification. When you get down to it, what is the reason that your customers should buy from you instead of your competitors? And here's a clue. It's not because you're innovative. It's not because you're customer-centric. It's not because you're green. Because all of your competitors would rightly claim the same exact things. What is the thing that you can concisely articulate that is the thing you can do and they can't? And then how do you tell a story that gets your customers to want to pay for those things? Here's a litmus test. If you were able to really crystallize this, put it at the end of your pitch deck, you would have a situation in which you could actually strip your logo off of your pitch deck, give it to all of your competitor salespeople. By the way, I understand this is completely ludicrous, nobody would do this. But give it to your competitor salespeople, they would go out and tell that same story, and all of those customers would still have to buy from you. Because you're the only one who actually does the thing that the sales pitch claims. You've led to a unique capability, not any capability, but a unique and differentiated capability. I'll show you an example of that in just 1 second here. The second thing is you got to challenge customers' assumptions. You can't come in and just validate what the customer already thought. And this is the trouble actually with most of the thought leadership we see out there. Teaching is a journey from A to B. And most companies want to talk all about the B. If the A is the status quo, it's the current state, and the B is the future state, it's what your solution can do, most companies will spend all day long talking about the B. And relationship builders, to be fair to them, are very comfortable talking about that, because the future is great. It's uncontroversial. But what's different about this is a challenger conversation spends just as much time breaking down the A as building up the B. Before we show people the future state, we've got to unteach them about the current state. We've got to show them why what they're doing is wrong, why they're missing something, why it's suboptimal, why they're missing share, why they're seeing cost leakage, etc. That's critical to getting this right. The reaction you actually want is, I've never thought of it that way before. That's the reaction you want. You got to catalyze action. Getting this right it's critical that you get the customer to realize that the pain of same is actually worse than the pain of change. And companies who really think about this hard and really get this right, in our opinion, have moved away from things like ROI calculators to actually talk about something like a ROPE calculator. ROPE is the return on pain eliminated. Your goal here is to show them an opportunity or a problem that getting after, while it's difficult, while it entails change, is actually easier than sticking with the status quo, which is costing you time, costing you money, costing you market share. And of course, it's got to scale across customers. This is why it's marketing's job, typically, most companies get this right. Very quick example, I'm getting the stage crook here. So very quick example, and again, we're gonna have a breakout session. We go a lot deeper on this stuff afterward, but I do wanna show you a very quick example from a company called Grainger. We call this the commercial teaching choreography. It's mapped back from the companies we see do this really well. When you see a challenger conversation unfold, it unfolds in this way. It starts with what we call a warmer. It doesn't start with a question, what's keeping you up at night? It starts with a demonstration that we meet with people like you all the time, and here are the issues that they're grappling with. Does this sound about right? And some corroboration, some demonstration that you understand their business. And right away, for the buyer, for the customer, it feels different. It doesn't start with questions. It starts with a demonstration of competence, of understanding of their space. But the critical moment is the reframe. We very quickly go to, here is how what you're doing is suboptimal. Here's the opportunity you're missing. Here's the driver of that problem that you're trying to get after that you're not appreciating. Here's what we see best companies doing that most companies aren't. It's the reaction you're looking for, again, is I never thought of it that way before. Or maybe I don't buy it. And so you've got to quickly back it up with data. We call this rational drowning. You got to make it personal. We call this emotional impact. You got to make it resonate for the person across the table. And then box number 5, the new way forward. This is simply showing the customer that wouldn't it be great to solve for that opportunity I just taught you was out there. It's supplier agnostic. If you have a ROPE calculator, that's where it goes. It's not the return on buying your stuff. It's the return on solving the problem you just taught them was there. It's not until the very end that you talk about your own company, your own solution, what you can bring to bear for the customer. Quick example from Grainger. Some of you have read the book, know this example. Now Grainger, for those of you who don't know, I love this example because they work in a very, very commoditized space. Look around this building, any building that you're in, your home office, a hotel you're in, the airport. Grainger sells everything that goes into the building. Everything from paper towels, toilet paper, to light bulbs, to thermostats and temperature control systems, fire control systems, et cetera, et cetera. They sell stuff that keeps buildings safe, reliable, comfortable, efficient. Now, Grainger salespeople were actually infamous in the world of B2B selling for years for pulling a trick in their sales meeting that became kind of a bit of a joke in the B2B world. Their salespeople would walk into the customer's organization, meet with the facilities manager, the MRO purchasing manager, and say, here's the history of Grainger. We were founded in 1928 in a storefront by Mr. Grainger. I actually don't know if that's true. I'm making it up. But they start with the history of the company, and they would then start talking about the mission and values of Grainger. And then came the signature moment in the Grainger sales pitch when the Grainger salesperson will pull out of a box that they dragged around with them to every single sales visit, the Grainger catalog. And the Grainger catalog, if you've never seen it, is one of the most expensive and thickest printed documents on earth. It's got 1 million SKUs in it. And they would drop it on the customer's table with a thud, and papers would go scattering. And it was designed simply to impress the customer by how many SKUs are in the catalog, how much stuff they sell. Most customers would never even open it. Never even open it. It was simply the throw weight and the sound it made when it landed on the customer's desk that was designed to impress. And they'd look the customer in the eye and say, Grainger sells 20% more items than our next closest competitor. Then they would unfurl a map of the United States with thousands of red dots on it. And they would say every single one of those red dots represents a Grainger distribution or warehouse facility. We have 30% more distribution centers than our next closest competitor. By then, it was about 55 minutes into the sales conversation. They say, we're interested, if you value these things, you'd like to work with Grainger as your MRO supplier. And over again, the customer would look the Grainger salesperson in the eye and say, yeah, if you can match the price of your next closest competitor, we got a deal. Love the catalog, love the big map, the dots, fantastic, but you got to match the price of your next cheapest competitor. Grainger, after a lot of hard work and answering that tough question, what is the thing that they do better than anybody else, has flipped their sales conversation around. So now the Grainger sales pitch, they come in, they start with a warmer. As an MRO manager, we know you're working on issues like this: safety, efficiency, being green, cutting costs, doing more with less, so on and so forth. But there's one opportunity out there that most purchasing managers have never stopped to think about. It's the cost of unplanned purchases. Now, for a facilities manager, this is a total head snapper because they don't think of their world that way. They say, well, what do you mean? Well, what we mean is the thing that's not covered by your planned purchasing contract. Not the paper towels, the toilet paper, the light bulbs, all the stuff you buy on a monthly basis. The thing that breaks once every 3 to 5 years. Have you ever stopped to think about how much that stuff costs? And Grainger's done the analysis, and what they can tell the customer is that on average, it costs the average company 45%. 45% of their MRO spend every year goes to unplanned purchases. Why? Because they don't get a discount on that stuff. It's not covered by their planned purchasing provider. They have to pay for expedited shipping. They waste a lot of time and energy looking for that rare part that only needs to be replaced every 3 to 5 years. And the customer often will push back and say, that can't be. Surely for us, we run a tight ship, it can't be 45%. They say, well, actually for you guys, it's 48%. We have your data too. Then they can tell the customer, wouldn't it be great if you had a supplier who could actually guarantee coverage, same discount, next day delivery, guaranteed stock on every single thing in your building, period. The paper towels, the toilet paper, the light bulbs, the air conditioning coil, the thermostat, you name it. If it's in the building, it's covered. Everything under the Grainger contract. And the supplier and the customer says, yeah, that'd be fantastic. Who can do that? Well, it turns out Grainger can. Why? Because we carry 20% more SKUs than our next closest competitor. 30% more distribution facilities. We're the only supplier in the space who can actually credibly make that claim. You can take this proposal and bring it to your current MRO provider and ask them if they can match it, and they won't be able to because they don't have the scale, they don't have the distribution that we have. So you see, that's hopefully a good example for you guys what it means to go from a world in which you're leading with to a world in which you're leading to, and why it's critical for the organization to figure that out, not the average salesperson. So it takes both sides. It takes the skills of the salesperson, the organization producing those insights, putting them in the hands of salespeople so they can go out and challenge customer thinking. We're going to have a breakout in a little bit, and we can answer lots of questions about this work, about the data. I mentioned the Asia data. We've done a lot of work on how do you recruit challengers, what kind of culture do you need in a sales organization to actually allow challengers to thrive in their environment, so on and so forth. So please come to the breakout. It's going to be after lunch, I think 1:30 to 2:15, if I'm not mistaken. But thank you guys for your attention. I'm running a little bit over time, but thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you afterward or at the breakout this afternoon.